Oh, you could have said a lot more, but you said too much anyway. Especially that part about only 37 minutes. I don't know what to make of the hero comment. I was not preaching when he was a little boy. I remember his dad with fond memories, though Tim's dad's a great man, of course, a former elder of the congregation here. And that sets my mind to thinking about Brother Bill Gallagher and Brother Fred Stancliffe, who's gone on and no longer with us, but enjoying their rich rewards. And you know, our hairs are getting grayer, those of us who still have them. And we could almost say the time of our departure may be at hand. Who knows who of us will arrive back home from this trip or be here tomorrow. Who knows if anybody will be here tomorrow in the flesh. The Lord may come. So we need to think about those weighty and serious thoughts. My deep gratitude for the brethren here, and I rejoiced when it was necessary for you to appoint you elders, that Michael and Paul were appointed, and I have the greatest confidence in both of these men. And Michael's been a dear friend and close companion in the truth for many, many years, and I've very much enjoyed their hospitality this week, and have a real good bed. The food I've been served has been top-notch. Room service could have a little bit of improvement, but other than that, it's been a very enjoyable few days for me. Not the first time I've stayed in the Hatcher Hilton. Levon and I spent a number of nights over the years with Michael and Karen, and have always enjoyed their good hospitality. Well, we could reminisce for 37 minutes, but that's not my assignment. Let's look to this period of about 4 centuries, a little bit over that, between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of our New Testaments. Numerous terms have been used to describe this 4-century period. We'll just refer to it as a period of silence as far as inspiration is concerned. And not a period of silence for lack of significant speaking or activities that were occurring that affected the people of God, but silence as far as inspiration was concerned. The historian's inspired pen no longer operated, and the prophetic voice was silenced during this period, and miraculous activity was unknown during this period. Until we come to Luke chapter 1, verses 13 through 19, where we have the angel Gabriel appearing to Zacharias in the temple in Jerusalem and saying, Elizabeth will bear a son, and he will be the forerunner of the Lord. The Bible doesn't satisfy our curiosity about why we have this period of silence. We can only speculate. Perhaps God had said all he needed to say at this point until the fullness of the time came for him to resume his revelation, as Paul refers to it in Galatians 4 and verse 4. Perhaps he needed to say no more because of the numerous details of Daniel's prophecies concerning this 4-century gap in inspiration. And we shall allude to that more than once in our remarks this morning. In inspired interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel outlined the progression of politics and power that would span almost 5 centuries, even beginning with Daniel's own time. And that, of course, is in Daniel's interpretation by inspiration of Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, Daniel chapter 2. Daniel foresaw Babylon's fall to Persia, Persia's conquest by Alexander the Great Greek, and then the rise of Rome that would eventually absorb or conquer the remnants of Alexander's vast empire. And Daniel gave specific attention to Alexander's domain and its fate upon his death, that is Alexander's death. Daniel's prophetic panorama of this 4-century period, where there's an inspiration gap, will serve somewhat as an organization for our study this morning. But for historical perspective, we need to begin where Jerry left off at the last lecture. That is, the period of restoration. For 2 centuries, the Jews were under Persian domain. And as was pointed out, the Persian Empire succeeded the Babylonian Empire, just as Daniel had told Nebuchadnezzar it would. It's sometimes called the Medo-Persian Empire because it was a combination between the Medes and the Persians, and sometimes the Persian kings are referred to as such as Darius the Mede, or Darius, as some people pronounce his name. I wasn't around, believe it or not, to ask him how to pronounce it. But we have a century, first of all, recorded by inspiration of the Jews under Persian rule. Now, when Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, the interpretation of which had Nebuchadnezzar out eating like a beast of the field and living like a beast of the field, he made this comment to him in Daniel 4:32, "The Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men." Now, brethren, that has not changed. We still live under a God who is in control of this world. Now, he allows men to do what they will do under his domain at times, as he was doing back in the days of Daniel. But God is still in control, and Christ is still on his throne, ruling and reigning as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the blessed and only potentate. He wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know that, and we need to bear that in mind when we get so bogged down in our great anxieties over the direction our world is going, our nation is going, and so forth, and there's plenty of room for anxiety concerning those things. But let's remember, God will rule and reign over all, in fact, eventually. The books of Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi record the first 100 years of the Jews under the Persians. Cyrus, per Isaiah's prophecy, chapter 44, verses 28 through 45, was named by that prophet. And when he came to the Persian throne over the Babylonians, he almost immediately issued an unprecedented decree, allowing a people in captivity to return to their homeland if they chose to do so, but not forcing them to do so. He further ordered from his personal funds the rebuilding of the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had raised. And Ezra tells us of this in Ezra chapter 1 and chapter 6 of Zerubbabel's taking a contingency of the Jews back with instructions and funds to rebuild the temple. After 70 years from the first deportation of captivity to Babylon, which was from 606 to 536 BC in total, just as Jeremiah had prophesied in chapter 29, verse 10, the Jews began making their long trek back home. Now some, such as Daniel and Mordecai and Esther, and no telling how many thousands of other Jews, elected to remain permanently in a foreign land. They had put down their roots there. They had reared their families there. They had gone into business there. They had connections there they didn't have in the old homeland, and so they remained. But others, such as Ezra and Nehemiah, delayed their returns for many years. There were 3 waves of deportation under Nebuchadnezzar, originally, so there were three waves of return under the Persians, led respectively by Zerubbabel, and then many years later by Ezra, and finally by Nehemiah. The Persians during this time were benevolent dictators. They pretty much allowed the Jews to observe their religion, their traditions, and even to govern themselves to some degree. Of course, the great enemies during this time were the mongrel race of the Samaritans. But the 2nd century under the Persians is not recorded by inspired men. It begins in about 432 BC and will go until Alexander's conquest of Persia in 331 BC. Except for Daniel's prophetic sketches from this point on, we must rely then on uninspired sources for our information. These will include such men as Flavius Josephus, the pro-Roman Jewish historian who lived in the last 2/3 of the 1st century AD. Some of the apocryphal books, particularly the book of 1st Maccabees, and Greek and Roman historical sources, along with some archaeological sources such as monuments and inscriptions and things of that sort. Well, the Samaritans continued their harassment under the Persians, and they would not completely end their harassment until quite a long time afterwards. In about 400, they built a rival temple on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, only about 20 miles from Jerusalem. They appointed an apostate Levite priest as the high priest, and that temple was long ago destroyed by the time of our Lord, but surely it's what the woman at Jacob's well referred to in John 4:20 when she said, "Our fathers worshipped in the mount," referring to Mount Gerizim. Were they right, or is it right that you Jews say we should worship in Jerusalem? That reference goes all the way back to when that temple was built 4 centuries earlier. The 1st century Jews may have despised the Samaritans as much for their mongrel religion as they did for their being a mongrel race. As before, the Jews in post-biblical Persian Empire were generally allowed to live without interference from the Persian monarchs, both in the homeland and other areas throughout the empire, allowing the high priest to govern subject to the Syrian provincial satrap or governor. Now we remember one exception to that, even in the inspired record, where wicked Haman tried to have genocide practiced against the Jews, and providentially Esther was able to intervene there. This brings us to the end of the Persian Empire with the rise and conquest of Alexander the Great. The power of Persia had begun to wane by the mid-4th century BC as a new force was rising on its western frontier, that is, in extreme Eastern Europe. Philip, the king of Macedon, after which the New Testament city of Philippi was named, had conquered and consolidated the power of the Greek and Thracian city-states, and had planned to challenge the mighty Persia that had been harassing his territory for some half a century or so. His plan was thwarted by an assassination in 336, and his son Alexander ascended his throne at the age of 20 years. He led his forces to follow his father's plan against the Persians across the Hellespont in 333. Won his first engagement with Persia in that year in what would be extreme western Turkey today. As he pushed eastward, he also pushed southward to Egypt, which meant that he went through the Jewish homeland. it's hard to know what to call it today. You call it Palestine, and it brings up news stories of Palestine in a totally different context from the biblical context of Palestine, but simply means the land of the Philistines. That's where Palestine, the word, came from. But he came down through the homeland of the Jews, and some suppose that they showed him Daniel's prophecies concerning his exploits, and he was greatly pleased with that, and was favorable toward the Jews, therefore. While in Egypt, he founded his namesake city of Alexandria in the year 300 BC. His forces proved invincible. Someone commented that he is the only general in history who never lost a battle. Eventually, he pushed the Persians back by 331 east of the Tigris River, where they fell, and per Daniel's prophetic announcement, the once indomitable Persia now belonged to Alexander and his Greek forces. If you know a little of the history of Alexander, you know he pushed even further eastward, even to the borders of India, at least, before his troops finally said, "This is enough. We've gone far enough." And so he came back and settled in the city of Babylon, and there died in 323 BC, 33 years old. I don't know if it's true, but I've long read the legend, at least, that he insisted that he have his hands displayed outside his coffin when his body was reviewed, to show people that you couldn't take any of it, even though you owned the world with you. Well, as his military victories were, his ambitions and influence went far beyond even those conquests and influences. One person whom I highly esteem wrote the following: "As Alexander swept across his areas of conquest, an impact greater than the sword alone can produce was eventually to obtain. This potent force was a body of ideas that was in fact a culture unparalleled in history. This refined Grecian culture, best known as Hellenism, came to be the chief contribution of Alexander's meteoric career. Its impress upon the world through language, literature, philosophy, science, and art has practically determined the course of subsequent history, especially in the West, but to a degree even in the East. The Jews were not immune." I said that with tongue-in-cheek, of course. Alexander was zealous for Hellenism, founding cities and settling them with Greeks, and even colonizing existing cities with his Hellenistic countrymen. Thereby he spread the Greek culture and the Greek language across the world that he had conquered. And as Hellenism spread chiefly on the wings of the Greek language, the Jews could hardly remain unaffected, especially since increasingly Greek was becoming the language of commerce. The earliest colonization that affected the Jews was perhaps in the city of Samaria in 332. As we shall see, Greek influence will come to play a major role in Jewish political events in the 2nd century BC. So now we find the Jews under the post-Alexander Greek Empire, 323 beginning, and lasting until 167 BC, when the Jews finally won their independence. Well, what about this gap between when Alexander died and this date of 323? Well, the empire fragmented after Alexander died because he had not named a successor. And there were two decades of internecine wars among their generals, among family members of Alexander. There were assassinations, there were plots, there was treachery, until finally, as the fulfillment of Daniel 8, verse 22, 4 horns sprang up out of that one horn. 4 of his generals divided practically all of Alexander's empire between them. Only two of these would affect the Jews, at least those living in the Jewish homeland. One of these generals was named Ptolemy, P-T-O-L-E-M-Y, and he got Egypt and southern Syria. Another of these generals was Seleucus, and he got northern Syria and the old area of Babylon. Little Judea was the sandwich filling between these two powers that fought over her for almost a century. During these constant wars or exchanges, they weren't major wars between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies came out on top for about a century. The Jews were allowed to govern themselves while paying tribute to Egypt, but during this time the Ptolemies exported thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Jews to Egypt and put some of them into military service, but many of them, they simply settled in Alexandria, the namesake city that Alexander had established. Well, Alexandria eventually had the largest concentration of Jews in the world, and many of these were very scholarly Jews. And the Greek influence there was overwhelming, as you can imagine, particularly the Greek language. Eventually, the Hebrews, the Jews of Alexandria, succumbed to the influence of the Greek language and translated the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures into the Greek. And so we have the rise of the Septuagint version, that word meaning 70 in Greek, or the LXX, as you will see it referred to in commentaries in Roman numerals, again, the number 70 being indicated because it's believed that approximately that number of Jewish scholars were involved in the translation. The dispute between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties was finally settled in 198 BC when the Seleucid king Antiochus III decisively defeated Ptolemy V. And that brings us to another fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies in Daniel 11, verse 31. The rise of the one who would be the instigator of the abomination of desolation. Antiochus IV, called Epiphanes, gained the Seleucid throne in 175 following the assassination of his brother Seleucus IV. And Epiphanes set about to enforce Hellenism on all of his domain, including the Jews. And it was from that enforcement under Epiphanes and even some of his predecessors that a group called the Hasidim among the Jews arose. This term means the pious ones. They were resisting the liberalizing of Judaism by the influence of the Greeks or the Hellenism. And the Hasidim will come back into play a little bit later. But Epiphanes proved to be the Jews' worst nightmare. We've had terrible, terrible tyrants in the last century or so in our own history. We have Adolf Hitler in Germany. We had Joseph Stalin. We had Zhou Enlai in China. All of those murdered many of their people. Epiphanes was a forerunner of those very cruel, heartless tyrants. And particularly against the Jews did he turn his wrath. In 70, he slew 40,000 in one assault against the Jews and replaced those exterminated Jews with Hellenist colonists. 2 years later, he launched a war of extermination against the Jews' religion, understanding that that was the source, or at least perceiving it to be the source, I think correctly so, of a growing opposition to his regime. And so on this occasion, he sent an army of 22,000 against Jerusalem. He waited until the Sabbath to attack, knowing the Jews would not resist on the Sabbath. And he burned the city. He entered into the temple. He desecrated it. He built an altar to Zeus on the great altar in the courtyard, and then he offered a sow on that altar. Epiphanes made it a capital offense in that purge to practice circumcision, to have a copy of the law, to keep the feast days and force them to eat pork and to eat meat that had been offered to pagan idols. In the year 167, now the date of his desecrating the altar was December 25th, 168. I want to mention that. In the year 167, a Syrian officer had demanded of a Jew in the little town of Modin, only about 25 miles northwest of Jerusalem, to offer an offering to a pagan god. And a priest by the name of Mattathias stepped forth and slew the apostate Jew and slew the Syrian officer, ran through the town and said, everyone who is faithful to God, follow me. And then he took his 5 sons and fled to the hills. He carried on a guerrilla campaign, not only himself, but through his sons, that did a great deal to bring independence to the Jews. He died within a year of his fleeing from his hometown, but his mantle fell upon his eldest son, Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus meaning the hammer. And from his name, the Maccabean revolt is named, as you can see. They were first conducting guerrilla-type warfare. They would leave the hills and run down into the towns and villages, and they would circumcise little boys, and they would slay apostate Jews, and they would give hope to those who still wanted to obey the law. But the Hasidim, who had earlier fled from Hellenism, joined the Maccabean effort, and that helped it along considerably. Within 2 years, though, of the time that the revolt began, Judas Maccabeus had formed a regular army. And in numerous engagements with the Syrian army, though always outnumbered, the Maccabeans were always victorious. So 3 years later to the day, the advances of the Maccabeans had been so great that he could march his forces into Jerusalem, recapture the city and the temple, and rededicate the temple. And he did so December the 25th, 165 BC. And he proclaimed a feast day, an 8-day feast, to celebrate the rededication of the temple. It's called the Feast of Dedication. You'll see it referred to in John chapter 10, verse 22. They were still observing it in the first century. In fact, Orthodox Jews are still observing it today. It's Hanukkah. That's where this feast originated. And you can see why December 25th is the date they chose, because that was the date, the day, calendar day of the rededication of the temple in 165 BC. So they had achieved their independence to a degree. At least they were able to reestablish their religious practices, and they had relaxed, those were relaxed as far as Epiphanes was concerned. But they were still subjects of the Syrian Empire, and the Maccabeans were not satisfied with just religious freedom. They wanted political freedom. They wanted to be an independent nation again, and so The Hasidim here separated themselves from the Maccabees because they had achieved their religious liberties, but the Maccabees kept up the struggle. Judas was killed in the struggle for this political independence in 161, and the mantle fell on another of his brothers, Jonathan, and he excelled at political maneuvering. He was an adequate military leader as well, but he really made gains through his political savvy. By the year 150, the Syrian monarch had named him the governor and partaker of the dominion, a co-governor with the king of Syria, in other words. Well, he was killed through treachery, and his brother Simon followed him and was so successful in battle that he demanded and received complete independence from Syria. He was also appointed high priest, giving him religious, military, and civil power. He had it all in his grasp, and the best information we can find is he did not abuse that. With Simon, though, the Hasmonean dynasty began. Sometimes these are counted as interchangeable things, the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty, but that's not accurate. The Maccabean revolt produced the Hasmonean dynasty. And the name Hasmonean comes from Simon's great-great-grandfather, a priest by the name of Asmoneus. And so when he actually became what we would call a king, they named the dynasty that started with Simon the Hasmonean dynasty. And it continued through several generations of their family, and it included some real scoundrels by the time you get to the third and fourth generations after Simon. For a few of those years, the Jewish kingdom achieved power and territory that rivaled that of Solomon's time. In 63 BC, the Hasmoneans were squabbling over power. And Antipater, an Idumean, which is another name for an Edomite, which is another name for a descendant of Esau, had wormed his way into government in Jerusalem. He was trying to put a puppet king upon the throne. And to mediate the dispute, the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem in 63, and from that point on, the Jews no longer had their independence and would be under the Romans until the Roman Empire would fall. Julius Caesar highly favored Antipater, and so he named him procurator of Judea in the year 48. After 1 year, he was assassinated, and one of his sons, named Herod, know him, don't we, was appointed procurator of Galilee, and thus a Herodian family enters Jewish history. After Julius Caesar died, Mark Antony named Herod king of the Jews in 37 BC, which title he retained until 4 BC when he died, and you can see that date briefly overlaps the birth of our Lord. Herod's paranoia and cruelty led him to murder many of his own family, including his Hasmonean wife and some of his brothers and sons, and of course the babes of Bethlehem. He was a great builder, an engineer. He built the great fortresses of Herodias, of Masada. I guess we mainly remember his engineering feat in the temple in Jerusalem, which he began in 20 BC and largely finished it within a year and a half, but they were still working on part of it when it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Well, Herod's death brings the intertestamental period to an end. The miraculous and prophetic activities are once more resumed near the end of his life. These, of course, continued throughout the first century until the gospel was fully revealed and confirmed, at which time they became inactive once more, as they shall remain until the Lord's return. Now, there were several developments in the intertestamental period that appear in the New Testament record, and I can tell for sure that I don't have time to get into those. You're going to have to read those in the book. But a little background on the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Sanhedrin court, and the Septuagint version. I would have liked to have said a little bit more about that, but we'll just close with these observations. Alexander the Great and his successors supplied the Koine, or Common Greek, as an all but universal language to the civil world during the intertestamental period. The translation of the Old Testament into this language made it possible for countless pagans to read of the one true and living God and of the prophecies of a Messiah to come. The Romans were not only great warriors, but they were great engineers and builders, resulting in a network of roads in the empire unprecedented. The Pax Romana that began with the accession of Caesar Augustus in 27 BC provided a period of political stability that endured for 2 centuries in the vast empire of the Caesars. All of these things developed during the silent years between Babylon and Bethlehem, providing the setting for the fruition of Daniel's kingdom prophecy. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and it shall stand forever. Daniel 2:44. The fullness of the time had arrived, and so God sent forth his Son. Galatians 4 and verse 4, thus ending 4 centuries of inspired silence. Thank you.